Hello everyone, today we talk about the appearance of the Janissaries and broadly speaking also about their tactics and equipment. This is a new kind of video I want to make on the appearance of certain soldiers rather than strictly, their functionality or their tactics. I will definitely end, as I was saying, to talk about this into this video because it's pretty much obvious, and it's really it started from the problem that I don't know excessively much myself about. I'm no expert about the Ottoman army and about the Janissary. I know something because here and there you learn about it. But I thought that that a bright solution would be to compensate, let's say, essentially my ignorance about the topic by introducing also certain elements of say of psychological warfare in a certain sense, or also an anthropology of warfare based on the sheer appearance, on the visual approach that you can have to armies, and this can invest also history of art and other fields. Today we'll try to stick to the strictly military affairs, since it's one of my videos dedicated to military history. But we will try to see, generally speaking, try to answer the question: how do I recognize a Janissary into open field? Let's say I am a an Habsburgic commander, or a Polish commander, or a Persian commander. I'm fighting against the Ottomans. How do I recognize the Janissaries into that army? And generally speaking, what really tells me that what do they tell me? Because that's also another character of warfare. There is in today, let's say that I think the major approach to military history comes from war games, and I often criticized this approach, not because I think it's wrong or bad at all. I think war gamers sometimes have been able to tell much more about military history than actual historians. But there are certain certain elements that of the wargamistic explanations that eventually get rooted into pop culture at a point that it's as if the whole business of military history was a sort of classificatory one. That is, that you don't care essentially to understand the functionality or the reason of certain features, as long as you can list them, as long as you can say in a very cold and classificatory way, categorical way, that I don't know, that unit is that one because it looks like that, it has that kind of weapon because those two sources, I don't know, told us once that they have those weapons. While military history is something extremely more complex, especially extremely more more changing and variegated in many ways. It's essentially a story of how mankind basically adapts to this extremely terrifying yet extremely even civilized way of interacting, because war is civilization largely, and if you understand this, people think that war is something opposed to civilization. War can destroy civilization, but it is civilization in itself, because some of the greatest improvements in civilizations occurred during war times, in many ways. But secondarily, if you do not attach a positive but neutral exception to civilization, you understand what it really means. People today are obsessed by a moralistic approach of history. I don't know why. And when I talk about military history, it didn't happen very much, fortunately, because generally I tend to keep out, even with the same topic. Lots of people were evidently not interested or have kind of a moralistic approach to history in the first place. I think the best military historians are people who come from a rationalist and an anti-dogmatic background. But it happens that once again in popular culture war is seen chiefly from a moralistic point of view, and then people don't even know what war is. And I'm not telling you, like it's usually said. I mean, that I'm not a veteran. I'm not. I've been for maybe an extremely brief time in the well, I can't say now about my past, but say I have practically nothing to do with the military, and I don't pretend to explain what is a war, as in terms of being there, participation from an emotional point of view, but war is something that it doesn't just take to be there to know what it is, in the sense that it's such a huge topic that sometimes certain military historians actually understand war better than certain military men. And think about Mattis, sorry, not Matthew, the warrior monk. I mean, he combined the two things. He had, well, I don't want to get into politics now, but just saying that he has a library of, I think, like 7,000 books, chiefly about the about military history, for saying the two things can definitely be combined, but it's just full of cliché, of stereotypes, of prejudices and preconceptions about war out there. And I can't say just in the civilian environment, but in saying the human approach to the thing as a whole. I think war has to be studied in order to be understood. And I personally decided to start this in my life, so I'm still quite early in time, if anything, for anographical reasons, but I think that it's worth of the pain, because it's such a fascinating part of humanity, and it has to be understood and not refused as a sort of, I don't know, non-human thing, because if there is one human thing for excellence is war. Sadly, tragically, I mean, I'm not attaching a positive sense to even to humanity in this sense. I'm just trying to tell things as they are. And relatively to the look and appearance of a certain unit on the field, you can't really tell an excruciating much about their culture, about the society they come from, their as well as just their military tradition, but also about their mental their commitment, their moral resources. So talking about the Janissaries, so I don't think I have to introduce the Janissary. They were this essentially the name in Ottoman Turkish means it would be Janissaries, I believe, that is the new militia, also known as Beuluk. And they were chiefly infantry, and they made up the essentially the private army of the Ottoman Sultan. There was also the so-called Kapikulu, or I don't know, the name varies. There are also the Kapu Qualki, I don't know how to say that. That was the men of the gate. There were something similar to the Janissaries, and initially there were even something more elite than them. And eventually the same Janissaries came to be part of that. But essentially they rose, the Janissaries rose as this permanent, or at least stable, force to basically of the sultans, to oppose in a certain sense to the rather unreliable Turkish tribal levies. This began actually very early in time, during the 14th century. Usually the foundation of the Janissaries is dated back to the 1362. So that is very interesting, not just because of their military tradition that went through the centuries. They were eventually abolished into the 19th century because they had transformed into something very different. Sometimes there is a sort of comparison that is done with the Roman Praetorians, something like that. The Janissaries is something more complex, also under the light of the Ottoman society, of Muslim society as well, that has certain characteristics, and I think the Janissaries have to be understood in a bit of a different fashion from, say, the Praetorians or other kind of guards that existed in the let's say that there are certain points, just like actually only on 3 occasions, if I'm not wrong, the Praetorians did more time. They actually, yeah, they kind of deposed other emperors, and or maybe they kept others the power so that they could manipulate them. But for the rest, they're a bit different. Excuse me, I drink a little. Well, not just a little. There was a lot of water. But anyhow, so this is just to give an introduction. Then I will definitely make a video about the Janissaries. Probably will be way more precise, because yesterday, to prepare this video, I actually read a lot about them, and I can't say the whole thing. This is just about their appearance, but here and there I'll try to crack some other information that can be useful. So, although I think we have to talk also about the organization of the Janissaries, because that is chiefly, if we want to talk about their appearance and how they could be essentially distinguished into the on the battlefield, that is definitely very important. So essentially, the Janissaries made up what in Turkish was called a okak. Excuse me, I'm checking, because here I wouldn't like. Yeah, the okak, which I don't know whether I thought, I can't tell. They were essentially an army. The Janissary did make up an army proper. Now, I wanted to search for the translation of okak, which I don't remember, because I was mixing it up with the one of Orta that we will actually look at. Ah, yes, so it is. No, I was right. It is wrong, because I found here a translation that is wrong. Or not. Let's go look again. Orta Janissary, because with these names, in Turkish, I don't know what. But whatever. Let's say that the okak were considered essentially the heart, or the home, meant as the fireside, the fireplace. And the Janissary made up, as we were saying before, an army on their own. Actually, they were the very bulk of the Ottoman forces in practice. We will see what their elite nature was really about, because the elite can also vary as a term relatively to the standards of the same army. I mean, something that is elite in a certain army might not be in another one. Like, the elite is like, I mean, the Janissaries weren't really this huge force, especially initially speaking. Today we will talk essentially about from the 14th to the 16th century, so a bit the moment of the rise and glory of the Janissaries, even in terms of military quality. But let's say we have evidence during the 16th century that were up to 10,000 or 12,000 Janissaries. We know that their strength actually varied also in peacetime, or before a campaign, so that maybe there were actually less. It seems that the number of Janissaries were less, like around 7,000. In previous times, even less. Obviously, you have to think that even the Ottoman Empire in this centuries is expanding, so that came the increase of the Janissary numbers kind of increased accordingly. But let's say that as in any other army in history, the organic really varied in the sense that that's a number that is always floating. You have to think about these times armies that were always practically under strength during the campaign because of attrition factors, and also because sometimes the armies basically resize themselves to even the tactical and strategical needs that they have. There are a lot of people also who flee the army, like the traders, how you say that in English. But besides this, the Janissaries OCAC was made up of three, say, divisions. It's a sort of divisional level. The Semaat. I'm really relatively to the spelling. I don't know. I know that they have several Turkish followers, so they will please forgive me about my poor Turkish pronunciation. The Semat that was made up of, there were these three divisions that were in turn subdivided into into units called ortas. The singular is orta practically, and they were corresponded to companies. Like ortas could be generally were a few hundred men. It could vary up to 800, up to usually I found sometimes up, because when you read about the Janissaries, you generally speaking the texts you read are mostly about the whole Janissary history, so it might be that the ortas were more were larger, especially I think during later times when like the 17th or the 18th century. But I think initially speaking there were like there could be even a minimum of 100 men or something more, so something like today's sort of modern company, up to something greater, up to a regimental size practically. And the Semat was the first of these divisions. It was initially, at least I think, conceived as border guards. So these Janissaries weren't just deployed into Constantinople as the guard and private army of the Sultan, but they definitely had their own. They were scattered also elsewhere. And this was very important because considering the size of the Ottoman Empire, you needed reliable forces at the frontiers. So the Semat was composed by 101 ortas, at least at the end of the 16th century, and part of them were made up also the Sultan's guards. Then there was the Bolok, who was another division made up of 61 ortas. And they provided either certain sentinels during campaign. I mean, there were certain ortas that had this specific function, because for the rest this was, say, an average troop that had to practically fight, and others made up even the HQ guards. And there were even these were usually even heavier guys, because as we will see, the Janissaries seemingly weren't extremely heavily armored, at least on average, which is kind of normal really considering the size of the unit and those times equipment standards. But we will talk about that later, because there are also other implications on on the general nature of Ottoman armies and what their tactical functions actually, their tactics really were. So The third one was instead the segments that essentially were the so-called dog keepers. Now, one interesting thing about so they had this kind of I don't know whether complementary, but they had something like 34 ortas. So these segments, because you have many names. Even these are all transliterations. Actually, I found even Sekban or Seir, Nen, so I really don't know what their real name was. But this was probably evidently a smaller size division and probably had some complementary role. What is interesting about the Janissaries is that their names as well as their grades were actually named after, I don't know, after servants of sort, like cooks, or here we've seen even the dog keepers. This was actually this is very fascinating because this was meant to stress the fact that there were serfs. The Janissaries were not freemen, and they belonged to the Sultan, who considered them as their own sons in a certain sense, and they're really their serf army. This is really the key for understanding the Janissaries. You know that at least originally they were recruited towards the sheer method. This was this very brutal levy that was carried out among the chiefly the Balkanic populations, especially mountainous areas like Albania, Serbia, Macedon, etc. The Janissaries were mostly Albanian in origin. These were taken as kids from their own families. In fact, every year when the Ottoman officials arrived to perform this recruitment, many of these Balkanic populations used to flee up to the mountains to escape this recruitment, because the Ottomans really kidnapped these kids to bring them to be Janissaries and basically not to come home anymore to their families. So they were taken prisoner, they were indoctrinated. Usually, I don't know about later forms of education, but usually the Janissaries were educated either in Anatolia or in Romania by certain local Ottoman sipais that were essentially the Turkish nobility. So even if the Ottoman Empire was pretty centralized state for those time standards, still you see that it was the nobles, like in other places also in Europe, that carried out the military training at their own expenses, evidently, I think, or maybe not, because they were theoretically, I think, paid even there with the Timar. I don't know what was the relation between the Timar and the Janissary recruitment, because there might have been, now that I think about it, but I'm not aware about it, of it. And they were posed to this very intense indoctrination training. They were grown in this sense in these very extremely Spartan schools, and they were toughened, and a very strong esprit de corps was created under everything under the Islamic teaching. But they remained serfs, juridically speaking, so they were different from the other soldiers. By the way, this explains why they were mostly infantrymen, because the Turks, in spite of their the Ottomans, let's say better, in spite of their let's say their old chivalric traditions of the steppe, had gone diluted essentially into the environment in which they developed, which was a very westernized one. Still influenced by chivalric traditions, by the way, but I say that they were far from the ancient costume of the steppe. It was mostly other external elements that came into the Ottoman Empire, still being able to perform that in the actual steppes fashion, even though cavalry in the Ottoman Empire was quite strong. But what I wanted to say is that it was an insult for a Turkish freeman essentially to fight on foot, and that's why the Janissaries were serfs, and this was actually a clever thing to do for the Sultans, because infantry was kind of the future at the time, and you need infantry, tactically speaking, in any war theater. As we will see, the Janissaries were developing actually an extremely sophisticated military unit. So I don't know why I stopped here, but relatively to the appearance of these guys on the battlefield, it's pretty much obvious that these divisions were kind of recognizable on the battlefield. I mean, if you were an enemy of the Ottomans, probably, first of all, especially the more time went on, I think the Westerners got aware of who was who in Ottoman armies. We have early witnesses of Westerners that were even in Turkey, because they went there sometimes in their journeys, and they began to describe the Ottoman army. And you understand that initially it wasn't very clear about even the strength about the Janissaries, or and I think we don't really know much about the Janissaries themselves, especially in terms of their internal organization, in terms of tactical specialization. We know probably more from the Western historiography than from the Ottoman one. I don't know the Turkish historiography, but I presume that, as it often happens actually from a certain time onwards in European history, the Europeans began to write a lot of things, while the rest of the world started to lag behind. So paradoxically, we sometimes know better certain peoples from the Western description than from the actual local memory, whether it's traditional or historiographical, but so it's difficult to even to tell, for instance, about their actual, for instance, the uniforms. The Westerners were quite struck by the uniformity of the Janissaries' dress, which was something basically unknown in the West. Definitely the idea of uniformity is something that has always existed in some form. Usually we say that uniforms in Europe, uniforms proper, are something for the army, essentially, because certain picked bodyguards had always this tradition of wearing this or that color in some fashion, but except for the whole army starts in the like in the Swedish army of the 30 Years' War, and then spreads all over Europe. But relatively to the Ottomans, seemingly these guys had a pretty good degree of uniformity. Even though certain sources that we have, chiefly from Ottoman or Persian manuscripts, actually display a much greater variety of colors. Now, I will explain it later, but what is important to say in here that because we think that certain ortas, certain divisions all had a certain color to distinguish them, which is not something strange, because it has an obvious tactical function of recognition. It has also certain psychological effects on the enemy. So you can definitely understand why it was used, and this was feasible, and this is the most important thing, because the Ottoman army was just like the Ottoman Empire, something pretty centralized, and we have evidence actually of certain cloth of golden silk being issued to the to the Janissary Corps since a very early time, like in the 14th century. Then eventually, by the 40s, I think, or the 15th century, they changed color. This was practically done by the state, let's say by buying a certain amount of clothes and then selling it to the Janissaries that at a certain time, I mean not selling but really giving it to them. And this happened also in other times in history, that you got the raw clothes and then you made at your own expenses your uniform, as long as it was of that color. And let's say that the concept of uniform is also something that has to be understood in certain contexts, because especially after, like, I don't know, after 2 months of campaign, you basically your clothes, whatever it is, doesn't exist anymore. We know actually the Ottomans were pretty keen on parades. They had, but there is also probably an actual tactical meaning attached to these uniforms that at the time, as we were saying, was something pretty rare to find on the battlefield. So that was intimidating for I don't know, even at the from a Western perspective, to see all these men wearing all same color, and more of that later, because that wasn't the only uniform thing they achieved. These were also very well trained troops. The Janissaries had an excruciatingly tough training, so they were pretty disciplined. Also about this we will have to comment, but that kind of gives the idea. Another way you could recognize so I was saying that normally when the Ottomans were preparing an army, the West already knew that in some way, because certain big movements are easily spotted. So at that point you could already sense that if the Ottoman army was moving, probably the Janissaries were in there unavoidably. Then during the campaign, in terms of reconnaissance, you could definitely see, also through spies and all within the same Ottoman army, who was there and who was not. So probably the Ottoman enemies knew essentially much better probably than we do today how the Ottoman army was organized, but it was sadly part of that knowledge, of that practical knowledge that existed in military affairs in a certain time in history, and that wasn't really put on paper, because it was essentially the knowledge of the sort of it wasn't a theoretical knowledge, and we are in the Renaissance now, so we at that time there was a lot of treatises being written and all, but these smaller things were kind of forgotten. It's a bit like in the ancient world. About, I don't know, the Roman army. We have essentially certain sources written by the Roman aristocrats that weren't the guys who practically made the army work, because the army worked already by itself, so that all that practical knowledge was forgotten because only certain people knew it, and those who wrote history either didn't know as much about it as the military. Either they knew it because maybe they were military commanders themselves, but they were at such high ranks that when they wrote about history, military history, they didn't bother themselves to write this allegedly smaller information. Excuse me, I drink a little bit more. But it's pretty obvious that the easiest way to recognize a unit on the field is its own sign. So we know that each orta, so each company had its own sign. And this is interesting because definitely the company size unit throughout all history has been probably the one through which the average soldier mostly identified himself. And this has always been there practically. Even into the Roman legions, it wasn't about the legion. It was mostly about the cohort, or even the maniple that counted, and not really the whole thing. The Ottoman Ortas had various symbols including keys, anchors, fish, flag, maces, and all. And these symbols were marked basically everywhere, from their tents to certain property, including weaponry, and even tattooed on the man. That was something pretty widespread. And that is very important, because being tattooed at the time means that not just you, I mean, you have probably sort of identity and spiritual attachment to that symbol that is essentially part of your skin, but it's also pretty, I mean, you can't really conceal your identity. So if you're taken prisoner, you're going to be recognized, because either you have the tattoo, or either you have a scarf, excuse me, not a scarf, a scar. I'm sure the Janissaries wore scarves at a certain point, but this is not the point. A scar, so you could be spotted, and that meant probably you were treated, you know, if the enemy knew that you were a Janissary, that was, you know, it was probably gonna be negative for you. So that was also a way to boost morale in esprit de corps, and basically not to give up, to fight till the very end. Naturally, the Janissaries, like any other fighter in world history, was not a superhero. So, in terms of powers and all, so they would surrender as well. But the Ottomans really felt. I mean, the Janissary were created essentially to be this fanatically faithful unit to the Sultan. So even falling, you know, even surrendering wasn't really contemplated. The idea is that the Janissaries are the same soul of the Ottoman army in a certain measure. So you have to imagine also this large banners that I mean, if you go this summer I went to Vienna, the beautiful military, the Museum of the Army, and there are beautiful Ottoman armor and banners in there. Were captured actually from a bit later in time, from relatively to the moment we're discussing now, because they were from the second siege of Vienna. But there were something huge. I mean, there is a sort of theatrical, scenographical impact to these things actually made. You have to think of these Ottoman armies, like actually most armies in the period, being extremely colorful, extremely terrifying just at the sight. So I think that it was pretty evident from a certain point onwards for any Ottoman enemy who were the Janissaries, just right through their insignia. But probably there were also certain other features that distinguished the Janissary. First of all, there was another great symbol of the Janissaries that was mostly used during parades, but I think it was brought into war. There was the Kazgan. So they were two copper cauldrons which were carried before the Orta on a parade, and they were slung from a pole and carried by two men. Now these cauldrons were quite important into the Janissary world, because they represented part of their camaraderie, as the Janissary food was cooked into these cauldrons in common. So that basically said, you know, we all feed ourselves from the same source. We are all part of the same unit. We are all sons of the Sultan and all this stuff. And actual Janissary rebellions took place by throwing these cauldrons on the ground. which was usually the traditional sign for revolt, because the Janissaries were serfs, but they also had lots of privileges, and they rose as sort of a caste into the Ottoman society. They had special privileges. Essentially, they could be judged only by their own martial court, that is, essentially by their own officials, etc. They had a salary. We know as early as, I think, in the 40s of the 15th century, so even before the fall of Constantinople, that as albeit serfs, the Janissaries revolted against the Sultan to get a higher pay. Then they had other privileges, including being executed in private. That I don't know how that is, and being, and their body being saluted by a cannon shot, something like that. It's pretty weird, but these were kind of things they cared. The Ottoman discipline was pretty inflexible in many ways. Even the same army commanders no failure was accepted, and this happened in other times in history. So military commanders who failed were usually strangled with a silk wire, something very crude, but we know that from these episodes that these Ottoman aristocrats always died with sort of dignity deriving from a sense of duty that evidently was felt, especially in these initial times of glory of the Ottoman army, as something really constitutive of their own culture and military tradition. Were all one thing in practice. So even the Janissaries were framed into this idea. By the way, the Janissaries seem to have been framed also in certain Islamic brotherhoods based on certain I think they are called Batkash or something like that, dervishes, that from a certain point, actually pretty late in time, were even incorporated. There were certain dervishes that were incorporated into the ordos proper. But the idea is that the Janissaries lived a sort of warrior monks in many ways. Actually, they were they had their own creed based on the Futuva Muslim ideal. That is, this idea of youth and manliness it's been associated to essentially Western chivalry. But probably the Janissaries were also inspired in their organization by the Hospitalier orders, the order that actually was always present in Ottoman history. Not just think about the siege of Malta or other major military events involving the Ottoman army, but it's really the influence that existed into this Anatolian world, where these crusaders were still out there in some fashion, and definitely the Janissaries were kind of also partially isolated from society. They had to chastity was required to them, although this wasn't really so true, because eventually, especially in North Africa, when they went there to assist the Berber allies, barbarian allies, we know that there was a sort of an ethnic group that was formed there. It was basically come from the they were called son of slaves, because they were people who were born from a Janissary and a local women. But aside from this, this is just for saying that the Janissaries had a sort of religious-minded, a monk-like military discipline, resembling actually the one of the Christian military orders in theory. Obviously, I don't want to say that there is a direct link between the two things, but surely there were certain forms of of monasticism broadly meant, etymologically meant, let's say, um, in the whole across Eurasia, that definitely had something in common with one with the others. Other ways to recognize the Janissaries was definitely their officers. The whole Okak was commanded by the Aga of the Janissaries, who had certain assistants, and who were practically the commanders of the second and third divisions. The higher officers were distinguished by 3 large white plumes and 3 smaller black ones, and they were set fun-wise in their heads. There were other officials, as well as other figures like that had, as we remember, all these kind of servile names. Like the Orta's commanders were called Korbachi. They were literally the soup makers. So remember the cauldron, the Kazgan cauldron. Well, that was the military of the symbol of the Orta. Well, the fact that the Orta commanders were called soup makers is kind of makes you get the idea, the ideology to which these Janissaries were framed as slaves. Were standard bearers called Bayraktar, other clerics, imams, because definitely their faith had to be enforced and reinforced, both during their training and the actual battle. So you have to think about these religious presences as sort of even of spies, to tell you that maybe knew what was the morale like into these units. Therefore, from the higher command could be used to investigate something like that. There were certain NCOs called scallions, Kara Kuluku in Turkish, probably and they were probably all distinguished by a certain either particular uniform or gear that could make them easily recognizable. So the coming back to the colors of their uniforms, actually we have an idea broadly meant that the Janissaries had certain standard colors of some sort, including black, blue, especially, and red, also purple, I think. Especially black, blue, and red. Let me think. These were colors that together with gold, that actually derived from a steppes tradition. Even if you think about the Mongolian horse, it was like the white, the red, and the golden one. So probably this had deeper meaning, and I think blue is, I didn't document myself about this symbolism, but surely they had a very deep meaning into Turkish military culture. And surely certain ortas, and so generally speaking, Janissaries all had this kind of color, or at least probably, I don't know, maybe in the same divisions, the same, maybe they were based on the divisions. I really don't know. What we know though is that possibly certain ortas, like the 33rd one of the segments, the huntsman, might have possibly worn another color like green. Another important thing about this is that the ortas, this is important, that the ortas were conceived in a hierarchical fashion, which means that the orta commanders could leave the orta command to progress to the one of another orta. So there was a hierarchy between these ortas. It's a bit like in the Roman army. You know, the centurions made a career within the same legion, passing from like the last cohorts to the first one, and to the first, the primus pilus was the first centurion. This is how the Janissary officers practically did, because otherwise it was impossible to leave your own orta. So relatively to the Janissary, there is probably a big deal of internal organization we don't know much about, but it was probably very orderly, yet also fluid in many ways, especially in terms of promotions and career, etc. The Janissaries usually wore a plain tunic, over which a short-sleeved kaftan of near ankle length was worn. Its front corners were usually hitched up and tucked into the striped sash, which ended into a gold or silver fringe. I'm reading this from George Gush, Renaissance Armies, page 81. So if you, just because I'm quoting directly, I feel the need to tell the name and the work and the name of the author. And then they beneath were blue trousers and yellow stockings. Now this book is actually saying, is attaching a certain degree of certainty about these colors. I don't know whether it's really, you know, I think this is based on certain evidence, but I don't think that historically we have the certainty of such colors and things. But definitely the most kind of distinguishing feature of the Janissaries was their headgear. So their headgear, basically it's the Janissary headgear is commented on by any source, either Westerner or Ottoman alike. And the Turkish called it akbörk, I believe it's the pronunciation. The Latins used, the Latin writers used another term in the 15th century, like mitra or pilos, while the Greeks called it, in vulgar Greek, not in the zerkula, which is very interesting because it's essentially a transliteration of the term kula, sorry. There was a male coif with a sort of shallow dish covering the top of the head, and the idea is, telling the truth, that this headgear basically was covering a male hood or helmet even. Actually, we have even direct evidence of this, so that kind of makes sense. The Janissaries were created not extremely, at least at the beginning, they were really a very elite force, and even later, it was a too large force to be considered properly elite. It was elite in the Ottoman army, but it was a bit different. But anyhow, let's say that such precious soldiers like the Janissaries were, obviously, you wanted them to be well protected, and the first thing you want to protect into combat is your head. So this is pretty clever. To wear, this happened also in Western armies, to wear this headgear, under which actually a very large one, under which a helmet is practically concealed. So this is kind of a clever move, because this idea of having, especially a very high headgears, is something that you find in military history to frighten the enemy, to look taller chiefly, but also to look intimidating in other ways. And there are many ways you can be intimidating in appearance, and definitely having this researched headgear is one, because you make essentially the enemy wonder, what the hell is this guy worn like? Think of 18th century infantry, the like with all dressed up nicely, and with face powder and wigs and all. You wonder what's the sense of that? Well, the sense of that is that if you go to war put up like that, made up like that, essentially, you're telling the enemy, I don't care about dying. I mean, I'm not there to. I prefer to show off in such a fashion than fearing you. That's the real thing. So even looking at these details can be really fundamental. So we have a description of the Akberk by the Byzantine author Ducas, who describes it as made of the widest felt, cylindrical in shape, snugly fitting the head, being as much as a span above the crown, and tapering to a point. There are also certain drawings from the Italian Bellini from the end of the 15th century that actually depicts, I think, a guardsman wearing an Ottoman guardsman wearing this hat. However, we should point out that this kind of hat actually was spread before the establishment of the Janissaries, and even afterwards it was worn also by other Ottoman, but maybe not even, also other peoples might have worn it. I really don't know about this. So there is evidence of this actually being worn before and even during in other and the word, however, still, the Janissaries wore the Akberk as a distinctive one, like the other distinctive hat, like the Azabs of the Turkish army, for instance, couldn't wear those, or at least they were distinguished by the Janissaries for other kind of hats. So the afterwards was the more characteristic sleeve cap that can be seen in the 16th century pictures. That kind of reconfirms partially what Ducas and Bellini had witnessed, essentially, and that eventually that was attached to the Janissary. I don't know, pretty messy sentence. I don't know how clear it was. Probably poorly clear. Another distinguished feature of the Janissaries, as we've said, was the so-called uniform. Let's say, I say so-called because, as we've seen, the concept of uniformity wasn't really completely out there. But at least for the Westerners, this was actually remarkably. It was a pretty remarkable thing that could distinguish them. Another feature, however, that relatively to uniformity, this might go to the to clothing, to their dressing, but not to their equipment. We have evidence at certain times, for instance, from the Ordo Porte, that is the order of the port, translated, I think, obviously, that the Janissaries have to be armed, essentially, each to their own liking, and each takes whatever arms he sees. Well, this is, it's kind of the Janissaries had, in this sense, equipment varies along history relatively to the tactical functionality. Here, the Ottoman Empire was centralized enough to have this standing army of some sort, but not yet to have a sort of systematical weapon reproduction and something like that. I mean, this was enhanced during the Renaissance, especially, I think, for artillery. but let's say that the Janissaries sometimes were actually quite resourceful in many ways. For instance, they produced gunpowder on their own, which is interesting because that means that around this unit was all sort of system of logistical system, autonomous logistical system. Initially speaking, the Janissaries in the West Tatar Turkish tradition, they were equipped with bow and arrows. And actually until I think still during the 16th centuries they received yearly 30 aspers for purchasing these weapons. So I think that this was also a symbolic sum, practically, to say that you are a Janissary, then independently from which kind of weapon you practically have. But bow and arrow is in the East a very noble weapon, unlike in the West, and it was a kind of a distinctive feature of partly of the Janissaries, I think, in their tradition. But we know that from the mid of the 15th century already, the Ottomans began to make extensive use of firearms, of handguns, and the Janissary actually became very skilled at these. The other Mihailovich, who had been actually into the Janissaries, I mean, not really in the Janissary property. I think he had stayed in the Ottoman army for like 4 years and had become something like a quartermaster or something like that. He says that relatively to the Janissary, that some are archers who shoot bows, some are gunners who shoot mortars, others handguns, and still others crossbows. It's interesting that crossbows were also used, because this is something that, say in the East, it was also about bows. No, there was also the crossbow, and this probably tells how the Ottomans were really multicultural in their military traditions, how they could really pick the best of every military culture and synthesize it essentially in their own. Then there is the Byzantine Lascaris that says that the greater part of the Janissaries were armed with only bows and swords, so these were still an early age, obviously. Other having bucklers, assorted spears and polearms, and some had some handguns and crossbows, to which can be added maces, daggers, axes, and javelins, the so-called diarite. So you can understand what this means. I mean, this is not really just about the kind of weapons that they were using. I mean, this is really about the fact that we're skilled at using them all. I'm pretty sure that even for the sake of tactics, you may want to specialize in one weapon more than another, so that we know that certain ortas were specialized in at least they had a certain equipment. We've seen the guards with halberds and all, so I think it's pretty obvious that the more the Janissary Corps was developed in time, and the more there were these tactical specializations. But I suspect that the Janissaries were actually trained in using all of these weapons, which is kind of understandable, because we're sort of, I mean, that's all they had to do. I mean, these were the kind of troops that in history are trained basically for all their lives in some measure. And especially in the early times, you have to think the Janissaries coming from let's say absorbing certain military traditions that were still pretty much alive, also in a sort of a tribal manner. That is, you basically live by knowing how to use a certain weapon. This tactical versatility is actually matching with all we know about essentially the Janissary performance into combat. Relatively to the handguns, we must say that also in other videos I made about the Ottomans, that the Ottoman Empire was pretty quick at using firearms, at integrating firearms in their army, in their military. However, this doesn't mean that it was something extremely quick. This is true especially for artillery. There was a kind of a strategical must for destroying, since the Ottoman Empire at a certain point is being built literally by conquering cities, including Constantinople, so that was an inescapable need. But relatively to handgunners, we have evidence that even at the beginning of the 16th century, the Janissaries weren't already that extremely skilled with arquebuses or similar weapons. They had also the Tufek, other kind of handguns. We'll discuss them later. But the idea is that the spread of arquebuses and was relatively slow. Probably, in my opinion, because not really because of certain of cultural resistance to the thing, but probably there was a sort of an environmental factor as well. I mean, especially when the Ottomans were swarming through the Balkans, I think that the terrain kind of favored certain kind of simpler weapons, also required less logistical needs. I mean, producing gunpowder, bringing arquebuses and all, something that it's very difficult to do in mountainous terrain at a broad strategical level. Those weapons are pretty useful mostly at a tactical level in open field. So these big battles into which we know in fact the Ottomans used this. But even in there we see that the actually took a lot of time before the Ottomans developed a certain say firearm tactics. They did it probably quicker than other Muslim powers, although this should be kind of debated a little bit because the Mamluks already, or the Mughals already made, say, in parallel with the Ottomans, I would say, extensive use of firearms. There is the famous 1514 Battle of Calderon, into which the Ottomans defeated the Persians, seemingly with their own by using essentially, I can say Pike-and-Shot tactics, but I mean in combined tactics involving firearms and fire of a line of arquebusiers practically. And the Persians at that time, the Persians even partly with the Mamluks probably used way more cavalry than the Ottomans did, even though the Ottomans for Western standards definitely made an extensive use of cavalry already. So it's as if from an Eastern perspective the Ottomans were actually pretty much more westernized than these other populations, and in fact the Persians are believed to basically have let's say developed firearms also in their own armies after the defeat of Calderon against the Ottomans. Because indeed that was a moment in history into which the Pike-and-Shot tactics were essentially winning over the ones of the steppes. This happened also in Russia. A bit later than that, the second half of the 6th century, when basically the Russians began to expand against the Tartars into the steppes, and basically the horse archer tactics couldn't work anymore against Pike-and-Shot ones, and this was a negative also because the Tartars had an idiosyncrasy towards firearms, what the Ottomans didn't. So part even of the tactical success of the Ottoman army has to be understood under the light of the combination of certain Eastern tactics plus certain Western ones. Even though probably the Ottomans weren't fully good at both one or the other, but the synthesis that derived from it was really amazing. And especially in artillery, the Ottomans, however, pioneered basically the technological development. The greatest inventions at the time were made by the Ottomans, even more than the Westerners. So it's kind of, especially the granulation of powder, that was basic before the bayonet, the greatest technology for firearm technology. So it seems that the triggering factor also of the adoption of firearms into the Ottoman army in the Janissary, more specifically, were the battles against Hungary and the Mamluks. Kind of makes sense, because these were two powers to be reckoned with. We had pretty strong armies and had already made extensive use of firearms since, for those time standards, at least, since a long time. So we have, however, evidence of handguns introduced in the Ottoman army since the early 40s of the 15th century. And the Ottoman ships definitely had artillery from at least the 20s, or at latest the 30s of the 15th century. So that's when they began even to think of forming a fleet on their own. It seemingly also the Ottomans at the Battle of Varna already made use of handguns therefore in a large battle with some tactical, at the point of being recorded, historically speaking. And Italian eyewitnesses at the Siege of Constantinople of 1453 actually claimed them to be using certain handguns that in Italian are called schioppetti or zarbattane. I think the Italian today is cerbottana. And which is interesting linguistically speaking, because it's the Italianization, the transliteration in Italian of a term that was used by the Mamluks, that was zabtana or zabatania, and that's how probably where the Turks had taken the name from. Another typical Ottoman weapon was the tüfek. There is a variety of arquebus that was developed by the Ottomans and used in the Janissary Corps from the 15th century to the essentially 1701. And I think in the Turkish language, tüfek, it simply means a rifle. In Turkish, I'm pretty sure that there is the Turkization of arquebus, that it sounds like arquebuts, something like that. The main characteristics of the tüfek are this relatively this damascate steel barrel. This is usually shorter, I think, than the average arquebus, if I'm not wrong, and the butt, the stock of the rifle has a sort of hexagonal section. I mean, it's kind of a, now I think I won't be putting a picture, but if you Google that, you can understand what these were. All matchlock, because the wheel lock actually was known by the Ottomans. This is very interesting, because the wheel lock is normally normally credited to be a mostly Western thing. Like, indeed, the Germans that at the time had the most, together with the Italians, the highest military technology, and especially from the clockmakers knew how to do this wheel lock, especially pistols that reduced the loading time and were used especially in the Reiter and the Caracol tactics and all of that. The Ottomans actually knew that, so this actually is interesting, because it kind of debunks with many other hints the myth that the Ottomans had were inferior in technology. Not at all. to the Westerners, but still the Turks preferred the matchlock because probably because of the sake of reliability and in terms of because the wheel lock is first of all it's more costly, definitely more costly, and then it can break down more easily. So since the Ottoman army was fighting practically everywhere from the Hungarian basin to the Persian mountains, and from the Ukrainian swamps to the Sudanese desert, you can imagine that the soldiers wanted to something they could rely on, so something even more simple and but definitely more, in this sense, more effective. I mean, it's a costs and benefit ratio that works all the times. So that tells you also that technology is not the answer normally in military affairs, but it's really functionality and doctrine of use that makes a difference. The etymology of tuvek, however, seems to derive from tuvek, that in the 11th century was a blowpipe used to kill birds with small pebbles, and so the even Zabtana has this kind of similar meaning. So it's interesting also how this comparing the Western and Eastern etymologies in here. The Western words are relatively more modern in the sense that they were created a bit from scratch. Instead, here it seems like the Muslims had they kind of looked back at certain weapons they already used when firearms were not known, but this is just mostly a cultural thing. The two other I think Italian authors, Tetaldi and Montaldo, relatively the siege of Constantinople, quotes the presence of 10,000 culverins that at this time were not the cannon, later 16th century cannon, but definitely handguns. I made a video about the 15th century artillery, into which I explain a bit of this terminological problems. It should be into, I don't remember the playlist, I think it's medieval, it's in medieval warfare and all. So yeah, a very interesting fact it is that the Ottomans at a certain point began during the 15th century, so this is still the moment of the advance through the Balkans, that they made extensive use also of Western auxiliaries using firearms, especially from Serbia and Bosnia. So this is kind of sensed because the firearms do cost a lot, and you have to understand the military force of the major powers of the time to actually provide themselves with a reliable source of this weaponry, and sometimes it's better to enroll certain auxiliaries that maybe already are equipped locally with these weapons, and this was the case with these Christians in the Ottoman army. Another thing that I think it's relatively to firearms, I think this is the right time to talk also about the Abus gun. That is something that I think I've looked chiefly at during the Napoleonic Wars. That's so an Ottoman involvement as well. And the Abus gun, however, is something that probably derived from earlier forms of portable guns that the Ottomans had. As I was saying before, the Ottomans were really pioneering artillery. The Janissaries tactical dynamism definitely also involved the usage of these portable guns that were usually they were essentially artillery pieces, like in the West. At the same time, there were certain muskets that were actually so heavy that they were considered a sort of field artillery that were operated by 2 or even more men. And what is interesting about this bus gun is that they had essentially the same function, in spite of the rate of fire that was definitely different in mechanism as well. You know, think of this modern machine guns. It was a kind of an accompaniment weapons, support weapons, used by the Ottomans in their, especially during the for cover fire, right? So they weren't really used against fortifications chiefly, but against humans, at least to create this suppression fire. So this is very interesting because the Ottomans are on the advance essentially at this time from a strategical point of view, and as we've said, they were masters of siege tactics, of assaults. The Ottoman tactics to basically invade, to storm citadels or other fortified positions were quite similar in the Renaissance to the ones that the Stoßtruppen during the First World War were being used, especially against fortifications. The Ottomans used to mine them, to make them blow, then to hammer the breach and the surrounding fortifications all the time, and then to launch at night assaults and to repeat all over and over and over and over and over again. So that is psychologically devastating. And the Ottomans had seemingly very good assault troops, so they were kind of specialized in this very aggressive tactical behavior. And definitely the Janissaries were on the lead on this because of their versatility, also their fanatism that gave them moral strength to carry out certain, say, blind courage in many ways. So the obus gun is just this kind of obus meaning howitzer, practically. Even caliber of his weapons could really vary over time, and depending, I mean, there was no real standardization at this point. Relatively to armor, were Janissaries armored? Hell yeah, the Janissary in this sense shouldn't be understood as anything very specific from a tactical point of view, as we have said. I was reading, I think that there were even certain cavalry regiments among the Janissaries, and I think this happened chiefly later in time, because initially that was precluded, I think, to slaves, but I mean it was still possible. And we have actual widespread evidence that even from the 15th century there were the Janissaries and other elements of the Kapu-Kalki war were armor, and the armor was sometimes very, very similar to the ones. I mean, it was definitely an Eastern influx, and also from the steppe and all. But even from the terminologies, for instance, the corazin, that the war was essentially the French cuirass or the Italian corazza. So, and think especially that in the Balkans the Italian armor was all around in terms of market exports. Like the Romanians, the Hungarians all had Italian armor at the time, chiefly because they obviously had their own armor as well. But let's say that the Ottomans, this is not surprising, they kind of had very similar weapons, armor to the one the Westerners had. In fact, in his travels of 1432-33, Brocquier wrote that the Ottomans, relatively to the Ottomans, I have seen them wear very handsome coats of armor like ours, except that the links of the mail are smaller, the vambuses were the same, and their armor descends almost halfway down the thigh, but a piece of silken stuff is attached circularly to the bottom of it that falls down to the calf of the leg. That'll this is very interesting relative to details of the armors, but I won't go into that. Maybe we'll do it another time. But it's kind of interesting that there is this French witness to their equipment. And we've already said about helmets worn under the tall white Janissaries caps. And always Tetaldi at the siege of Constantinople states that the Ottomans, about a quarter of the Ottomans wear some sort of armor, either hauberks or leather jacks. A few even wearing Western, chiefly French or Hungarian style of armor. So it wouldn't be weird to see Ottomans actually wearing some kind of Western armor. I don't know, theoretically even a full plate Milanese armor could be worn. I don't know, something like that. It's definitely possible. It's interesting also the presence of leather jacks that are known in as guns in the East, and we don't have any Turkish examples surviving, but we have for the Mamluks, telling the truth. This is very important, I think, for the appearance of the Ottomans, because the Ottomans, the appearance of the Janissaries, because from the very early age, I don't know why, the Ottomans had a military band called the Meteran Table U Alem, that is translated here as the military band. And since the 13th century, allegedly, should be a little of a consideration here. It's not that other armies didn't have bands, but it's think that the important thing here is that they were permanent of some sort. And you have to think a little, even if it doesn't come out in sources extremely often, but rather often, telling the truth. Even Western armies all had military bands, but were more aggregated. The Ottomans, in this sense, instead wanted to create something more centralized, something more dependent on the Sultan authority. So these bands, and think also about the meaning attached to this music. Now, as modern people, we have rationalized music, but think especially in the Middle Ages, what these instruments actually meant. There was definitely certain cultural, deep, say, cultural meaning, even religious meaning, considering also, especially from, I think, from the Muslim side. And one prominent, seemingly the Ottomans didn't have many trumpets. This is interesting, but they had drums. Which is kind of interesting in terms of the psychological effect that we want to do on the enemy. That is a sort of a terrible, gloomy sound, not just a glorious, vivacious one like you can do with a trumpet. So drums were out there, obviously also everywhere. But the fact that the Ottomans didn't use simply another great deal of other sounds together with them. They had lots of bigger and smaller drums, so probably there was also some sort of interaction, and this is witnessed actually at, for instance, the Battle of Turkan. I mean, it's pretty known, and it's pretty famous that the Ottomans had this early musical tradition in their army. And relatively to drums, I think I want to pass to another thing. There was the Janissary pace that I also find terribly fascinating, because among the various privileges that the Janissaries had was to have their own march step. Now, yesterday, when I read about this, I tried to repeat it because I think it's fantastic. Basically, it works like this: 3 paces, pose, 3 paces, pose, and at every pose, basically you make an half turn to left and right. That is basically a turn of 35 degrees. So I got curious and I said, what is this thing? First of all, it's like it's as if you were doing a sort of zigzag movement. So your if geometry doesn't betray me, you're basically doing, considering a square root, you're doing like a 41% of apparently unnecessary distance in more. But I think that from a from a psychological point of view, this is something terrifying to watch and to hear. Just imagine all this with the drums. So this very extremely gloomy and heavy sound, boom, 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 like the 3 passes we've said, boom, 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 and what these guys does, because I did it straight. I tried to march straight. I do it now as well. Unfortunately, you can't watch. But the idea is that if you do 3 paces in front of you, you basically just go like this, pum, pum, pum. Then the problem is you basically leave your feet are one behind the other, so you're not standing firm symmetrically in front of you. You remain in this kind of a foot behind and a foot in the front. So, and that's not very martial. So what these guys invented basically was the 3-foot thing, that when you stood with the 3rd foot, basically you with the boom, 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 with the firm foot that you have already placed, you turn around and you step with the other one, turning at 45 degrees. So it goes, let me check again, 1, 2, 3, and with the 3rd one, basically you turn at 45 degrees. So the foot that you had say behind kind of turns as well a little bit, and you can stand with both feet symmetrically towards that degree you have turned. So the result during the march is that at every 3 paces and stop, you turn at 45 degrees. Then you go other 3 paces and you turn another 45 degrees. So basically, when you advance, what's the effect of this? It can seem very weird, apparently, but just think at what it could be to see, I don't know, 10,000 Janissaries in open field to march against you, never looking straight at you. Never, because they are turning 45 degrees at every time. And like this, boom, 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 turn, and the whole army turns at 45 degrees. I mean, from a visual point of view, that's kind of frightening. You see the whole army shifting 45 degrees every time, and never watching at you, but advancing steadily at you. It's like as if those were machines, not men. There is something terribly frightening about this, because it's really you kind of really sense that there is something very wrong is going to happen. And this is very martial. Think that with the sound of the drums, boom, 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 turn, and a whole army turns right, then boom, 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 and a whole army then turns left. I mean, it's really disturbing. I'm not aware of other. Naturally, we have to say this is that this can be performed. This was performed definitely in parades, but also in open field. But the conditions in which this could be performed in open field were not always so perfectly the same. You need a ground you can do this with, but and definitely the majority of military operations you could find a Janissary in were kind of other operations, like mostly siege warfare, maybe other skirmishes and ambushes and stuff like that. But just thinking open field, scenographically speaking, what this practically means, it's extremely frightening. It's something I couldn't think. I mean, and I think it was worth noting it. And in conclusion, I think we can add a bit more. No, there are a couple of other things I can say about the Janissaries' appearance. We have talked about their cap. What I forgot about to say about this cap is that certain units, actually it said it, but not about the cap, that certain units were, say, marked by the certain details. The Janissaries had especially among the senior soldiers, certain picked members like the Forlorn Hope, like I don't know, in the contemporary German army you can find in the Renaissance the Doppelsöldner, you know, the ones who were literally paid more because they were the guys that had to go in front with the double hand swords to basically find a gap among the enemy pikemen. It was something extremely risky. In fact, in the Ottoman in the Janissaries, these units were called Serden Jack. They were literally the head riskers, which is pretty meaningful. Or the others were called Dal Kilic, I believe, bear swords. And these guys had in their headgear certain precious stones, especially in the nozzle, that probably was still part of the cap, because as we've seen, the cap was worn over a helmet, so the nozzle was present. We have evidence of this being worn also by higher rank officers, but now I don't want to be. And plus also they were distinguished by bird of paradise plumes. So there was a sort of it had to be a sort of an immediate sign of mark of identification for these special units within the same Janissary, the same Janissaries. The other equipment could be powder horns and stuff like that. That was for the rest, the Janissary uniform was generally plain, neither very slash or decorated. So another characteristics instead of a Janissary is that they had completely shaved hair, but for a scalp lock there was, and that they left usually was in the back of the head, and were also clean shaven, but for large mustaches, because essentially only free Muslims could wear a full beard. And since the Janissaries, as we've seen, were Muslims but not freemen because they were slaves, they could only wear a mustache. Although I've seen that there are some exceptions, it's, at least iconographically speaking, I think eventually the Janissaries, these are all, I mean, talking about the Janissaries is 500 years of history, so it's very complicated really even to sum up everything in a kind of unique, that there were certain traditions that would definitely change over time. It goes without saying that in the Janissary ranks, armor was more widespread, let's say in earlier times, because eventually with the development of firearms, just like in the West, basically soldiers stopped wearing armor because it was too costly eventually for nothing, because firearms could pierce through most of armors, and the ones who didn't up to a certain point was so expensive that they were rendered useless. So generally speaking, the Ottomans, excuse me, I always say the Ottomans, the Janissaries were pretty lightly armored, but this conferred definitely also the tactical flexibility we were talking about before, and they were masters also in combined tactics with different weapons. By the way, the Ottomans definitely had other forms of weaponry. We've said they had axes and maces. This is very interesting because usually these are weapons that are used against armor. So this is not really a proof, but I suspect that the Janissaries were conceived in such a fanatic, with such a fanatic tactical aggressivism, that maybe they were sent even against armored guys, being mostly unarmored themselves. So axes and maces were good at, as we know, as hitting armored people. Then it had lots of scimitars, the Kili. I don't know if you've ever seen it. They have an almost 45-degree turned, let's say, bended blade. So those were actually pretty widespread weaponry, like in the Turkish world and the Eastern one, broadly speaking. They also had daggers and knives and of various forms. Think about the yataghan, of the kanyar, etc. And so very nasty weapons, I would say. The and usually in peacetime, the Janissaries usually only wore mace and scimitars. At least they didn't belong to the as we have said, the frontier troops, like in the case of the Sema At. And this was it. But there is one other thing that, I mean, answering to who were the Janissaries, and how could they be spotted in a certain sense? Well, one characteristic is their fire accuracy, or fire length, because also in here there is always this military history, this confrontation between Western development firearms and the one inside in the Ottoman Empire. And at the siege of Malta, actually, we have evidence of Turkish sniper fire from over 150 meters, that is roughly 500 feet, that basically created such a high suppression fire that the rampart sentry walk was untenable. So we don't know excessively much about the development of handguns into the Ottoman army, but we think that essentially it went the same way, at least up to the 17th, even beyond, up to the 18th century, just like in the Western world. Montecuccoli in the second half of the 17th century, when he captured the Ottoman gunpowder after the Battle of St. Gotthard, said that it was of an excellent quality. And so the case of Malta, for instance, is actually tells us that actually Turkish firearms were capable of shooting longer than European ones, but it's a sum of anecdotes more than else, as well as the fact that seemingly the Turks did not use the musket rests. This is strange. I actually never thought about it before reading it now. And might be it's kind of strange, because the functionality of the musket rest is pretty evident for using such kind of weapon. It's very heavy. It has to be lodged in this. I've seen actually certain large axes over which basically I don't know how to. There is a more specific term. No, but these kind of very long axes that now I don't remember the name. They basically were used essentially as musket rests, very dynamically speaking. That's something you find in, I don't know, I think that the Russian streltsy, for instance, were equipped with such weaponry that they definitely had this very interchangeable use of weapons. So anyhow, there was never a real standardization in the Janissary equipment, and usually these guys equip themselves just before going to campaign, so that could vary. You know, the equipment, like in most times in history, was really could vary depending on personalization, customization, and stuff. So definitely, however, there is the passage from arrows to firearms in 16th century. Generally speaking, second half especially, the main Janissary weapon was a firearm. The half pikes were also used for combat, and usually the Janissaries attacked also pretty much in hand-to-hand combat. We've seen that were pretty aggressive, and in that case they would slung their muskets on their back and rely on an assault with shield, buckler, often, and scimitars. So buckler and scimitar actually correspond to a very dynamic individual fencing that requires also very high quality of training and etc. And before the assault, they wailed war cries. So yeah, like that, and that is something kind of normal in all military history, and that's meant to frighten the enemy in the moment of the attack, in the very moment of the attack, and yeah. There is however, a general thing I wanted to say in the real conclusion now, relatively to the comparison with Western infantry, because the Janissaries were really the best infantry the Ottomans could field. But compared to the West, say that the Ottomans had basically everything, and basically better than the West in certain forms, aside from infantry. Well, actually also cavalry. I mean, I don't want to make this broad generalization, but let's say that aside from the individual unit, what is really important is the doctrine. Like, the Ottomans had an extremely left aside the field fortification. Oh, by the way, the Janissaries were extremely versed in field fortifications. They were usually deployed in the center of the armies, entrenched, defending the Sultan that commanded them directly, by the way. So they had this huge prestige, were even in sieges were pretty active and all. And aside from the logistical capabilities of the Ottoman Empire that moved huge armies at the time that the Europeans were extremely terrified by. But there is also a doctrinal side of all this, relatively to the ability of moving as one, actually very diverse contingents. The Ottomans rose there was this core of the Janissaries that in fact was meant to basically provide an answer to the Pike-and-Shot infantry that the Europeans were developing, that was very coriacious for the Ottomans to take down, because it was pretty massive, especially in defense. It was very tough to crush. Because the Ottomans didn't have such, probably it's a social reason. I mean, the European commoners, the middle classes, were more developed than the Ottoman ones. Already the Byzantine Empire was less developed in terms of economical dynamism compared to the West. I mean, so the Ottomans inherited certain areas into which there were very developed cities and urban centers, but say that there wasn't that middle-class vitality that existed in the West that could produce such very good infantry. Sometimes there were even militias, like in Germany, were very drilled and good, on average, local burghers militias that could be fielded even in pitched battles and all. But the greatness of the Ottomans in this sense is that they recruited their army a bit from everywhere, like the Timar system, basically equated to the fact that, I don't know, there was a great difference, I don't know, between the European Timars and the Asian ones. They recruited essentially the troops in the local military traditions. So when the army was put together with this Janissary corps, but the other amount of troops like in support, but very diverse, I mean, there is a great military capability in making them work all as one, especially considering that they speak different languages, sometimes they're of different religions. The Ottoman armies were full of Christians, notoriously. There were lots of also allies that fought together with the Ottomans. In this sense, also a lot of Christians fighting against Christians. So many military traditions, even differences in religion, so everything that kind of makes the internal, the army cohesion kind of being on average weaker, but still the Ottomans managed to work in this. And therefore they relied on very quick light tactics, especially they had light cavalry, lots of very good like cavalry that the Westerners didn't have. But as we've seen, for Eastern standards, the Ottomans didn't have as good cavalry as the one of the Persians or other Eastern populations. So the Ottomans really were a hybrid. They were essentially a Western-Eastern hybrid, because this is the real nature of the Ottoman Empire. It was neither Eastern, neither Western. It was a mix of both. And this was seen also in actual combat. So what I wanted to say is that basically the Janissary were tried to compensate their inferiority as infantry compared to the Western ones, especially during the development of Pike-and-Shot tactics, in being this extremely aggressive, tactically flexible, and industrious and also multitask unit. And that's why they were also so feared, because they were very good at doing many things, and especially were professionals, something that normally the Western militias really weren't, at least on average, because, you know, if you take the Spanish tercio, that was a professional one. But you know, let's say that at least Western infantry at this time were, especially the Austrian ones, that basically didn't have a professional army until the 18th century in the Maria Theresia's reforms. It's kind of, you know, there were professionals in the sense that there were people who went out there fighting freely, like volunteers and all, but in this sense, you know, until, generally speaking, you have to think about this in history, that until you have a centralized state, you can't have really a professional army. Unless you are not in a tribal context into which the, I don't know, the people normally fight for a living, but in that case, usually the tribal society is so simple that the real weakness of that is you have a very low collective training. So really, the Janissaries are a bit the best expression of the Ottoman cultural adaptability in terms of military affairs, and I think they're very, very, very interesting and very fascinating. And I think I will make lots of other videos about them to go a bit more in detail about their equipment, their organization, how they fought in single battles and all. This was just an introductory video to tell what they kind of looked like, because I think especially it's important to do it with the Ottomans, because the Ottomans, I'm a bit of rediscovering them thanks to these videos, because with the Ottomans we have built the idea that they were something else from us. Instead, they were so close to us in many ways, that they received so many influences from us, and they gave us so many influences, and especially in military affairs. I mean, if you go throughout all Central Europe, you find that all the nobles, Western nobles, like to produce weaponry and armor in Ottoman fashion to send them as a gift to their own other fellow nobles, because the Westerners were terrified but extremely fascinated by the Ottomans. This is pretty much unknown. I mean, for anyone who has at least a superficial knowledge of European culture and history knows that it was a sort of an obsession for the Ottomans during the Ottoman Wars. And what we lack sometimes is the other perspective. Like, we should understand how much instead the Ottomans were looking at the Westerners and adapting their army accordingly, because they didn't just have to look about the West. The Ottomans were pretty involved into the Middle Eastern affairs, so they normally had 4 fronts opened, like the one with the say the Germans, or the one with Venice, the one with Poland, the Polish-Lithuanian Confederation, and the one with Persia. So think about what degree of civilization it takes to take this empire so strong and so powerful for so many centuries, and it's kind of not surprising that eventually declined. And this decline, this is the most important thing, didn't derive because of actually of a technological or a sort of military decline. Kind of happened because it was a sheer quantity of resources. How can you resist with 4 open fronts at once. Think about the siege of Candia carried out by the Venetians. I mean, that bled the Ottomans white. I mean, it was something extremely costly, and the reason a whole state eventually collapses, and when a state collapses, even the military does. So that's eventually how the things happen. But aside from this, I think it's enough for today, and I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested to receive news about my upcoming videos. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye!